Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm the president of Balancing Act. We're delighted to have everyone participating in this webinar. But Balancing Act is a company that's been around for about 22 years, but it's just been about the last 18 months or so that we have found our way to the issue of housing. And it's been a very gratifying experience to work with planners and city managers and public engagers to try to find a way to improve the public engagement process when it comes to housing, especially as so many places are facing housing shortages. This webinar is a part of a series that we're doing, trying to find ways to encourage people from across the globe really to share ideas and approaches that they found to be successful with regard to doing public engagement on the housing, especially using a simulation. I'm really honored today that this is the first time ever that we have sort of the three driving people that, or entities behind what has become a suite of three approaches to Balancing Act Simulate for Housing. And the three areas that we have, and we're going to have hear from each of the speakers that sort of help develop those in just a moment. But we have one simulation that is especially useful for getting a sense from the public of what type of what the housing type they want. So do they want single family homes, duplexes, apartments, et cetera, but not just what they want, but what can they is really possible within the scope of trying to meet a goal. And so Jordan Widdenstrom is a planner from Sutherlandshire, Australia. And so all the way from Australia, he found us and reached out to us and had this idea to develop a simulation. And we're really delighted that we worked with him to try to help see that vision through. And now it's something that's available through our Balancing Act software. In addition, we've got a use for the software for area. And Renata Robles from the city of Lafayette, they were the ones to originally sort of conceptualize how that could work. And that meant in adding a map to our simulation, which we're really excited about and I think has multiple uses. And so she's going to talk about using Balancing Act at that level of engagement to look at areas for density or areas to increase housing units. And then the first person we worked with is Christopher Jordan. And Christopher Jordan, almost by necessity because of COVID, but necessity actually led to some really great invention in terms of thinking about how a simulation could be used to meet a housing goal and really to not just make do during a time of COVID when you had to be socially distanced, but to really just transform the whole process. And so, as I said, this is the first time that the three of them have been together. We have found that very slim amount of time when it's both the workday in the United States and it's also the workday in Australia. So I was joking with our guests from Australia that we're touching the future by having them here. It's actually about 10 o'clock in the morning tomorrow there. So we're really glad that we could find this time and to include everybody here. Just one other thing I want to say is that we are especially grateful to the Association of Bay Area Governments. It's a consortium, or it's the Council of Governments for the San Francisco Bay Area, 109 cities and counties. And they saw the potential, really the potential that was developed by the three folks that we'll be hearing from in just a moment for this type of a tool to really transform public engagement on housing and to really, to help communities really work together to come up with effective housing plans. But it was Leah Zippert at the Association for Bay Area Governments that had this idea of doing a bulk license, which allowed not only for 25 Bay Area cities and counties to use our software, but for us to also make some improvements to it that could be make it much easier to implement some of the ideas and features that these guys had us come up with. But also, I think very importantly, to create a user group so that there was a group of support. So we welcome especially those of you who are coming to us from the Bay Area, but also from around the world. We've got people from Wisconsin and Vermont and Texas and New York and several from Australia. So we're really looking forward to this session. I'm going to turn it over first to Christopher Jordan, and he's going to talk about, we're kind of going in reverse order. If you were to think about a logical process for how you might think about using a simulation in housing outreach, you might think of going type area parcel, but we're going to actually go chronologically and go parcel area type. And so I'm going to turn it over to Christopher Jordan to tell us what they've been doing in Elk Grove, California. And it's really some remarkable work. So Christopher, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Chris, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Great to see you all and be able to talk about this. So I'm going to go through a few slides, and then I can throw up the platform as we ended up building it and using it through a couple of different exercises and activities. But this effort has been around what we call the housing element. Knowing there's probably a lot of Bay Area folks, you are all familiar with this. I'll try not to go too deep into it, but since we have some folks from outside California and outside the United States, I figure a little bit of background and summary would be good. Mandate in California is every city and county has to have a comprehensive general plan, or a comprehensive plan as it's called in some parts of the country. And included in there is the housing element. Essentially, this is the section of the document which talks about where you're going to plan for housing to occur. For our California friends, you know the pain and suffering that comes along with going through this process, and how exciting and riveting the state legislature has made it, certainly the last couple of cycles. So our housing element was due in May of this year. Pleased to say that we met that deadline. It took a little bit of extra working with the state, because it's subject to state approval, to get through. And as of last week, we have our conditional certification. The council's done some cleanup on it, and we now have a certified element. So we are very happy to be done with this process, and absolutely have no eagerness to come back to it in 2029 when we need to. Part of the process involves identifying the need for housing that occurs within a community. This is a process which starts at the state level. The state identifies sort of growth needs or growth demands, projected growth needs for each of the different regions of the state. For us, we're outside of Sacramento, so it's for the Sacramento Area Council of Governments that the numbers get established. And then the Council of Governments is then required to then spread those numbers out to each of the member jurisdictions, the unincorporated counties, and then each of the incorporated cities. These are the numbers which we were assigned for the planning period. These numbers are broken up by income category. So for the total planning cycle, we need to accommodate about 8,260 units, 8,260, but those get broken up into these different income categories. And the way the state looks at this is essentially density equates to income. So for the lower and very low income categories, we have to meet minimum density requirements. Those change throughout the state based upon your local characteristics. For us, it's pretty much anything above 25 units an acre is what we try to hit, which was basically a garden style apartment or better. For the moderate and above moderate income units, those can be really at any residential density. Honestly, we have that housing type coming out our ears. It's really common to see a 3,500, 4,000 square foot house on a 10,000 square foot lot. So those are never really an issue for us. The moderates started to become an issue. We'd like to see more alley load product, more townhome development. We don't get a lot of it, but that's really more the income category and the product type we'd like to see there. So really it comes down to, how do we allocate sites? We have to identify sites, we have to zone for them, set them aside in order to be at these different income categories. And for our low and very low income, obviously those start to look like apartment complexes. So where do these go? As you can imagine, for those of you that have been through this, obviously there is a lot of pain and suffering that comes through it. You have community opposition, you have councils and planning commissions that are really hesitant to do this because of the political implications. At a staff level, you're throwing spaghetti against the wall and hoping something sticks and you meet these numbers, because if you don't, you're in really a world of hurt with the state and trying to get things that are approved and get projects built and get state funding for various things. So really, it's a lot of problematic efforts to go through, but certainly a noble and worthwhile goal. So we go through this process of identifying sites. We were able to roll forward about 18 sites from our prior element that had not been built on yet, and that met some minimum qualifications for ability to get into production. And then we started throwing that spaghetti on the wall and looking at a variety of candidate sites. So we had 43 sites in total for the low, very low income categories. Here's a basic map of the city and where all those sites were. Some of them were in our new growth area, which is basically at the bottom of this exhibit, sort of in the central area. You can see a lot of those E-designated sites that were existing. We've got a fairly robust new growth area that's under development, and we have master plans, specific plans for those areas, and have done a really good job over the last 10 or 15 years of carving out high density sites in those areas for them. But the balance of the sites are citywide. Really, the majority of the sites are citywide. And just, again, that spaghetti was sort of out there. Couple things through this process in prior elements to go through this effort and identify the sites and have this dialogue with the community. We would host public meetings. We would send out notices to folks. We would get people around a table or in a room and discuss them. We put up a slide deck. We talk about why we need to do this. Obviously, there'd be a lot of opposition. We would get people that were closest to the sites that would show up in the meetings. They'd only want to talk about one site, the site that was closest to them, and their comments would by and large be negative in nature. For this element, and this was sort of going into it from a pre-pandemic standpoint, we wanted to try to change that a little bit. We were thinking, okay, let's have more meetings, let's do wider outreach, let's try to make sure we get a more diversified population of folks to attend. Obviously, all of that really got messed up. Our outreach strategy was actually kicking off at the end of March of 2020 and then into April. We never obviously got any of that up off the ground. We had dates booked at rooms. We were just about to start the notification process. Then the local school district closed. It was the first school district in California to close. So we said, let's hold off and see what this looks like over the next week or two. And obviously it all just sort of went downhill from there. We had also heard at the beginning of the process from our council, they were really worried about the distribution of these units around the city. Again, staff's tendency has historically been, let's get these into new growth areas. And it makes a lot of sense. You don't have the resident population there when you're doing the master plans to lay out, you know, to have opposition. You're just really dealing with one or two developers that are doing these master plans. You can try to manage those expectations and set those sites around if you sort of balance the land plan right. But the council was like, look, we're hearing a lot from our folks, particularly in one district where all the new growth is happening, that we're overloading. We need to spread this stuff around. So we need to look at it on a district level basis. So we said, okay, look, if we're going to have to look at this as a system citywide as a staff, we should get the community to look at this as a system. That housing, much like water and sewer and transportation, it is a network of sites, and the interaction of those sites together with all the other housing and other land uses in the community is what makes Elk Grove a great place. So how can we look at this as a system? How can we get the population to think about this as a system? And it came down to, how can you put folks in the same seat, in the same review process that our planning commission and our council are going to be when they have to approve these plans a year later. So in order to do that, we obviously did our newsletter listings. We've got a newsletter goes out every goes out every 2 months to every household in the community. We figured, okay, it's COVID, everyone's doing webinars, we'll do webinars too. Those had varying levels of engagement. One thing we decided to do, partly as a result of COVID, but also just sort of managing these sites and the calculation process, something we had toyed around with in the prior cycle. How could we have a tool to do the calculation, do the calculation and manage that? Okay, what's in, what's out? What do we do as we change things on the fly? Do all that math. Because if you're doing it in an Excel file and you're having to delete cells, it just becomes a real pain, and it's not fun in the middle of a council meeting if you get a decimal in the wrong spot. So we'd done a bunch of research and ultimately landed on Balancing Act as a great platform to do this. And between Chris and his team, they were able to accommodate us in making some really core fundamental changes to how the platform presented itself to the public and allowed it to work for us in a very simple way to get out to folks. This is a system of sites. Pick the ones that make the most sense. There are trade-offs. If you don't like the site nearest you, you got to pick something else. You've got to look at this in the totality. So again, it put folks in that position, just like our planning commission, our city council would have to go through, of looking at every site and picking what's in, what's out, and having a completed plan. So it is a tall bar. Again, there's like 43 some odd sites. Everyone had to look at all of these. I'll show you in a minute what that ends up looking like. But it really was a lot. It is a lot to look at. We ended up getting about 1,300 page visits, about 542 people that were confirmed with IP addresses in the city. Chris has got a whole back into this where you can look at the analytics driven by Google Analytics to understand some of that. We ended up getting 91 completed plans, which for a city of about 178,000 people doesn't feel like a lot, but it gave us a good grounding in understanding the community and understanding what some of the feedback points were, that we had confidence walking into the hearing process that we had a touch point in understanding this stuff. And at the end of the day, from a sites perspective, this ended up for me being one of the easiest housing elements I've been through. Everything that we had problematic through the process was really a state issue. For those of you in the Bay Area that are getting into your elements and you're thinking about the AFFH stuff, affirmatively furthering fair housing, HCD's still working through what that looks like for them. And I encourage you spend a lot more time on it internally and with your consultant teams. That ended up being a bit of a stumbling block for us a little bit. So I'll just go run through real quick some of the feedback that we ended up getting for existing sites that we were proposing to roll forward. All of those were included or had some level of increasing density as something the community supported. The red line here is 50% support for increasing density. Everything got at least 55% or 56%. So we felt really good moving all of those sites forward. When it came to the candidate sites list, every site got at least 55%. We ended up setting a threshold for ourselves of 65 as the basis for recommending the site move forward into the hearing process. So I think that worked out really well. Again, I'll jump over here real quick to the platform itself and how we built this. I think everybody can see it. So for this, what we ended up doing, this is the splash page. We put some good context information to go into it. My partner on this, our Housing and Public Services Manager, Sarah Bontrager, put together a video that we did some in-house production on that then gave folks a good 3-minute overview. What is the housing element? Why is this an important issue? People could watch it. We pushed it out through social media channels, got a lot of eyes on it, that sort of educational piece to it. Then what we ended up doing was we took the sites and we split them up into our 4 council districts. We have 4 districts and 1 directly elected mayor. It is a council manager form of government here in Elk Grove, but we do have a separately elected council member that's on a 2-year term. So we just broke everything between the districts. We thought this was the most reactive to the council's direction of think about the distribution. There are sort of neighborhoods around the city, and we ended up looking at it different ways for the hearing process. I'll show you that in a minute, but not everybody sort of knows what neighborhood they're in. Districts is a little easier for folks to understand because there's just only 4 of them. So within each of these districts, we then set up the existing sites, and these were sites that they've got an existing zoning on them. We're going to retain that, or we gave folks the option to increase the zoning. And then you could leave comments for us. There's other features here, as you'll see in the platform, and Chris can talk about sharing on social media and tweeting and all that sort of stuff. We turned a lot of that off because we didn't want to get the system spammed with people just coming in and downvoting one particular site. Again, wanting people to think about this as a system of sites. And then for our candidate sites, it was just a simple yes/no toggle. We started them mostly with defaults of no. You could come in and add them, and the math will just automatically happen. So the great thing about the underlying basis of the platform being on the financing side, it can add really well. So it gave us that ability to have that calculation happen in real time, and it was consistent, and we never had to worry about an Excel spreadsheet with a decimal in the wrong spot. For the housing needs allocation, we put in our base allocation for the low and very low income categories here. Something that we have to think about as planners ahead of time in the process is all of these sites could be developed with affordable projects or market rate projects or something else allowed by the code, by our zoning code. So we could end up with a site that comes forward with some sort of assisted care facility, and we can't count a certain number of those units, only those that are if they're non-medical units, we can capture them. Well, many of them maybe are medical units. You can't capture them. Maybe they're not income restricted. We have to make up that capacity somewhere else in the system. We call this locally the buffer. Our target as a staff was to have a buffer of 25%. We knew realistically 15 was probably where we were going to land. I think our final allocation or final plan came in at about 12.5. So pretty darn close. I know we're going to burn through that in about the next 3 years, just the way development happens in Elk Grove with the types of projects that we get. So I'm hoping we make it till 29, but I sort of know in the pit of my stomach we're not. So it'll get us where we can. So at the end of the day, we had to have, you had to get to a balanced plan. This little slider across the top moves over as you start selecting those sites. So that's what we had as the public facing. People were able to go in, submit their plans. You had to have a balanced plan, at least in the green, if not much further over with more buffer in order to be able to hit the submit button. When we got to the hearing process, we built 2 versions of this that built off of that. Some of these 2 versions, one was just grouping it by the existing sites versus the candidate sites, probably how we should have done it for the initial outreach. If we could do it over again, I probably would do that because the existing sites, most people are just going to sort of look at it at a staff level. We could have defaulted these like we did here to, yeah, we're going to rezone these. And you have to come in and consciously lower the density in order to change that. It shows you get more mileage out of the existing sites, which I think is kind of a good thing. And then the candidate sites, here we actually had our staff recommendation as the basis. And then as we went through the hearing, if the council or commission said, oh, you know, wait, I don't want to include site C3, we can turn that off and now see instantly what happens. Again, the math all goes on in the background. You'll notice, and Chris can talk more about the background and how this stuff works, but there are functions in here in order to show some additional information. When we did this, Lafayette hadn't come along, so the mapping element didn't exist. So we ended up using static maps to show the locations of these sites. This is obviously a really horrible one with no context to it because of its location, but I'll pull up this one to give you a better sense. Our GIS department just threw these together real quickly. We already had all the shape files and stuff in the system. So it's just about creating these little thumbnails and tossing them in. So it gave folks a good understanding of where these sites were. The third version we did was by neighborhood. Again, probably another good way we would have done it. I think if we had the mapping that now exists in the system where you could put the map up here at the top and see them locationally, that would have been even better. But now we can now break these up and see where the units were by neighborhood. And this absolutely helped the commission and the council feel like they were distributing these units in a more, as they saw it, equitable way. So again, we had this pre-programmed with the staff recommendation. There were a couple of minor changes at the hearing, but really straightforward process. So I think with that, Chris, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you and we can go on from there.
Good, thank you. That there will likely be a lot of questions. And so we've got some time at the end reserved for that. And especially for those of you who are in California, Christopher is a great resource because he's actually gone through this and he's used this public engagement approach and he's been generous with his time so far. So please take advantage of that at the end. And you can also put questions if you have them into the chat and we can try to answer those on the fly. But we will definitely seek out some questions in a little bit here. So Christopher gave a great connection to the next speaker, so Renata Robles in the city of Lafayette. They are the ones who came up with the idea for the map, and there were a fair number of struggles to make this work and have it all function correctly, but it was really a fun and gratifying process to go through with them, and they actually paved the way for, I think, one of the most significant innovations that we had, so to have the map. So Renata, I'm just going to turn it over to you to share what you guys have done in the city of Lafayette, California.
Thank you, Chris. All right, I got a couple slides here. So good afternoon and good morning as well. My name is Renata Robles. I'm an associate planner with the city of Lafayette. I've been here for about 2 years, but I grew up in the town next door, Orinda. So our city, we started our housing element update process in early 2020 and really formalized the process in the fall. And so this was one of the things that came about through our engagement strategy development. So for those who aren't in the Bay Area, Lafayette is about 20 miles east of San Francisco. We're a smaller city of about 25,000. and we're predominantly single family zoning, except for in our downtown core where you can see most of our multifamily projects are located. I think Chris did a great job on the housing element, so I'll skip that. But our regional housing needs allocation for this current planning period increased significantly, over 500%. And as a result, we are looking to, we're going to have to upzone zoning districts most likely and significantly. And so we wanted to look to the public to help us define how and where to do that. So to what degree we should upzone, where it should be focused, and we kind of framed it through a series of 4 online workshops. So kind of starting with the broad and narrowing down to the specific. So we first wanted to have group conversations about what housing means to us, and then from that identify what our common shared priorities are for housing to then inform what kind of density we want where. And then the last step was the specific site identification that Chris was speaking to. And so for this solution generation, so figuring out where we wanted that density together, we were very excited to work with Balancing Act to kind of try to create to gamify the experience and get that input for us to use. So similar to Chris, we wanted folks to kind of struggle with those trade-offs and understand what the considerations are that we're making as planners and how it informs the ultimate recommendations that are going to our Planning Commission and City Council. But because we don't want, or we don't need everybody to be experts, we don't necessarily want everybody to try and become planners. We need other people to have other jobs for the world to go around. We did want to, provide supportive structure within which they could create those solutions together. And so we did this in a online conference platform called Remo, and it was kind of World Cafe style, small groups of folks. A facilitator would put the simulation on a table and they would have to work together to make a housing plan. So everyone kind of had to say their piece, but also balance that with everybody else while also getting the required number of units that they had to get to. And there was reference to the map. We really, really wanted there to be a way for there to be visual feedback. So as people are making these decisions and changes, we felt it was important for them to see it in context of the places that they're familiar with in the city. Like, oh, is that next to the Safeway, or is it next to BART, or is it near my house? So, and that was a really important piece, and we were so happy that Balancing Act was willing to work with us through that. And then finally, we were excited that this platform was able to give us kind of data to inform and back up our decision making. So we could point to this many, kind of like Chris's threshold criteria, this many people wanted this much housing in this location, and kind of go from there. So we decided to go with geographic boundaries because we are focusing on using this information towards updating our densities. We are not able to update the density of single parcels because most of them are so small. So we wanted it to translate more directly from what people were making decisions on to what the end outcome and end result would need to be. And so we use the geometries from our EIR, Environmental Impact Report for CEQA, as the basis. Underneath those larger geometries, though, there were some preliminary opportunity sites identified, and we used the acreage of those sites to help calculate that density. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later on. Another key element of the visual feedback was that the colors of these shapes, these polygons, intensify as the density intensifies. So people can kind of see holistically how it's clustered and grouped across the downtown. And Chris spoke to the buffer. We had options for buffers as well. For the workshop, we did require everybody to use a standard one, just so we could have comparable results. And we also did require that folks meet or exceed our RENA allocation to submit. And at the bottom of our page, we included these graphics of different densities to kind of illustrate what these numbers mean. Not everybody has an idea of what 35 dwelling units to acre, 100 dwelling units to acre means, and that's what really matters to people, how it looks and feels. So we wanted to make sure there was a point of reference for folks. Parallel to this too, we did also develop a walking tour, which included information about recent projects, including the densities, so people could go out in the city and kind of learn a little bit more about buildings that they were already familiar with. So we included that as a resource as well for people to understand the density that exists in our city and what it could look like. So it's not a big scary thing of, 4 stories, but we already have that. So I'm going to switch to the density briefly, or sorry, the simulation briefly. So similar to Chris, we included a video to talk an overview of the housing element. So it wasn't necessarily specific to the simulation, but more so to give people the background if they hadn't been participating previously and they wanted to come and complain, they at least had this other opportunity to get some background and context. And here we decided to also just provide a little bit more clarity, because when you open this page, it is a lot of information. And so we're trying to kind of give folks a preview of what they're about to see and what it means before overwhelming them. Up at the top, we decided to put a few simple steps about what they're supposed to be doing and what the intended outcome is. With the balance bar, we have the map, which unfortunately is not showing the colors. I think I chose the wrong simulation to show here. But you can see how you can click on the map and it will, this one's not working, I don't know why. Let me pull up another one.
I can pull it up if you want, Renata.
Sure, that'd be great.
Let's see here. Unless it's, yeah, there we are. This is the right one. Yeah, so
yeah, if you click on a shape, it'll take you to that area, and you will adjust the density, and you can see the unit yield as well as the density, and the color intensifies to show you. So we had a floor of the existing density because we can't go below that, but folks could go as high as they want to make their thing, and you can also see, to make their housing plan, you can also see how different polygons yield more units or less units based on that underlying calculation.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna give it back to you now.
Okay, thanks. And I'll be wrapping up shortly. So in our workshop, we did challenge our folks to make a housing plan. We used the meeting mode, which was awesome to be able to have real-time results from that session and be able to compare that session to individual submissions later on. And it was really interesting to see the commonalities and differences across the different tables. And some people really just chose to go all in on this downtown spine along the highway. Some people wanted to spread it out a little more evenly. And so that was really helpful for us in getting an understanding of folks' initial priorities. So our takeaways from this experience in working with Balancing Act for housing, it really helped us familiarize stakeholders with what the decisions are that we're having to make and what the constraints are. It's also a means by which folks can have a say in where that density goes and kind of advocating for their priorities one way or another. One thing I would do next time is probably outline the parcels underneath those polygons. That was like the biggest question we got for sure, was what is the basis of this? And so we are planning to most likely iterate again on this once we have our EIR to get more refined results and information of how precise opportunity sites could inform the density that we're looking to do. All of our documentation from our workshops and all of our housing element work to date is also available on our general plan update website, planlafayette.org. So feel free to poke around there. Tons of information and resources, including our Engagement HQ site, which is with Bang the Table, and some of our activities there are still live. And with that, done. Thank you.
That's great. And once again, ask questions or save your questions for just a few minutes from now. I do want to show just a couple of things before we go to Sutherland Shire, Australia. Christopher mentioned the results on the back end, and I'm not going to do a full tour of the back end, but the back end has 3 levels of detail. It's drillable, but this is what the top layer looks like. And so this is just showing this orange line shows the people that went through the trouble of actually coming up with a housing plan, the 91 people that you talked about that actually went through the entire thing and did what you all have to do as public officials and come up with meet the housing goal. And then we also tell you from the people who went on the simulation but didn't ultimately submit, that's what the teal bar is. And then we also give you median. And once again, you can drill down and look at 2 levels deeper detail on each of these. And then we also collect all of the comments that people leave over here. And then I also wanted to just show you, this is one of my favorite slides. This is Renata up here in the upper left-hand corner looking like an air traffic controller. And this is her colleague, Sarah. And this is how they adapted the tool to be used over Zoom. And Renata mentioned meeting mode. Meeting mode is a synchronous meeting feature for we can make a special instance of the simulation and use it in a live meeting, whether it's an online meeting or a face-to-face meeting. Obviously, during COVID, a lot of them are going to be online, but hopefully we're seeing some mix of that a little bit and moving at least towards the availability of face-to-face meetings. I know that's a very important part of the toolkit of planners is face-to-face meetings. And then I also wanted to this is what the results screen looks like for the meeting mode. And then I also wanted to show, and this is a bunch of people using meeting mode. This is pre-COVID, obviously. I wanted to also go over here. So another innovation since Renata and Lafayette used introduced the mapping feature to let residents indicate where they wanted density to go. Sometimes density, I'll just confess, I'm not a planner. Density units per acre, dwelling units per acre, and density is something that's hard for me to imagine. And so part of working through this group with Bay Area cities and counties was to adapt it so that it could be that same approach could be used not necessarily with density. It is density, but to actually look at units. And so now you can click on here. This is actually Brisbane, California. It's a little bit south of San Francisco. And you can go down here and you can click on something and it actually shows the number of units. It allocates units as opposed to density. So that's now an option on the back end. And we expect that might be used for some cities and counties that think that that's the best thing for them. Now, I'm really excited. This is the first time that Jordan Widenstrom and Christopher Jordan, we've got a real economy of names there. And then we've also got Christopher Jordan and Chris Adams. This is the first time that the 2 Jordans have actually been on the call together. And they were really the first 2. Lafayette had the innovation with the map, but the 2 Jordans are the ones that independently saw our budget simulation and said, I think we could use that for housing. So you guys both had that insight, and we thank you for that. It's been wonderful for us, and we hope to be serving you as well to help that be a sort of a full circle. But we're really excited to have to learn about Sutherland Shire. Not only because they were an innovator in terms of looking at yet a different use, a different version for Balancing Act, but just as somebody who's been involved in public engagement for 25 years or so now, I'll just note that Australia does a terrific job. And I think that actually US cities have a lot to learn from the approach that Australian cities take to public engagement. A lot of it is enabled by electronic community engagement platforms. And I think Jordan's going to show you that in just a moment. But before we go to Jordan, we've actually got Andrew Carfield, Jordan's boss, who is the director. He's got a very large portfolio in terms of what he's the director of. But he just, because the purpose of this call is not just to look at software and to just look at narrow technique, it's to look at how do you actually get something, use the public engagement process to actually get to your goal. And so Andrew's going to just say a few words about how his observations on this and how all of what we're talking about today fits into that. So Andrew.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really a privilege to be able to share with you our experience. And firstly, I just want to start with a little bit of context around our housing strategy project. And then my colleague, Jordan Winstrom, will present on how we've applied the Balancing Act tool to consult with our community in developing a housing strategy. Sutherland Shire Council is a very large local government area in southeast Sydney. Our population today is around 230,000. We're surrounded by water and national parks with the Georges River, the Port Hacking River, the Royal National Park and the Pacific Ocean, not only making it a stunning location, but also providing very effective growth boundaries. So all of our future growth and development scenarios within Sutherland Shire are based around urban consolidation. And from a regional context, Sydney is growing and changing. High-level plans have been developed for Sydney's regional population growth. Sydney is among the fastest growing regions in the Western world. By 2036, Sydney's population is projected to grow from its current population of 4.7 million to 6.4 million. And by 2056, it's anticipated to reach 7.9 million. And part of Sydney's population growth will be within Sutherland Shire, which is a very affluent coastal community. Here in Sutherland Shire, the median house price is about $1.3 million Australian dollars. It's a great place to live if you like to surf or you've got a large boat and an awful lot of money. And so I want to relate to our challenge here and relate this back to you. When I say that having conversations with our local community around future growth is not an easy task, I'm sure you'll all appreciate that. And I would relate this to having a conversation with the community around choosing between either rationalising a community service or increasing local taxes. But rather than select between one of these options, in my experience, community feedback will almost always come back with a desire to increase local services and reduce local taxes simultaneously. So gaining meaningful community feedback on a long-term and complex urban issue is never going to be straightforward. And this is why we found the Balancing Act tool to be so critical in our engagement process for Sutherland Shire's housing strategy. And I'm going to hand you over now to Jordan, who will explain just how we use this tool.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. I'm Jordan. I'm a strategic planner from Sutherland Shire Council, and this is the third housing strategy I've been involved in. The past housing strategies that we've done, I'll have to admit that community consultation has been extremely difficult. As Andrew mentioned, we are an affluent community. It is an aging community, and a lot of our current population have lived in the area for a long time and are reluctant to see the area change. There's a phrase that's often used for our population, and that's NIMBYs, and it stands for not in my backyard. And in that regard, people are willing to accept change as long as it doesn't have an impact on them. So that's all good and well, except where we're directed from above. So in local government, the state government above us gives us housing targets, and we're on a periodic program to provide more additional dwellings every 5 years. And those targets change and are often aligned with where infrastructure is provided from the state government. So with targets coming down from above, as a council strategic planner, we can't simply say no to housing in the area. And we have to have that conversation with the community on how we can best accommodate that to meet the current demands of the community, the future demands, as well as balance the existing character of the area that people have come to love. So it's a complex task and something that I think, as Chris mentioned, and it seems like all councils deal with, is that you're often met with a lot of angst from the community when it comes to the discussion of housing. So as a planner, before this current housing strategy took off, I remember sitting in a roundtable discussion with other planners from my council and thinking of ways that not only to have the community feedback, but to educate them at the same time. We've in the past just simply asked for submissions back to from the community, and 99% of the times they're negative in the responses that we're hearing, and they're simply saying that they don't want to see any change, but that in reality isn't something that we can actually achieve. So it's where we came across the Balancing Act as a budget tool, and we tried to work out a way that we could tailor that to have the community members kind of put themselves in our policy making shoes and be faced with the same difficult questions that we are in this process. So the Balancing Act was one of 3 tools that we utilised as part of our current engagement. I'll talk to it in detail in a minute, but I'll just show the other tools we used were geographical pin dropping tools where people could provide suggestions, and then the old-fashioned housing survey where people answered questions. Based on the feedback we received, the Balancing Act submissions far outweighed any of the other submissions made to us. So we have a population of about 200,000 people. Typically, we put stuff on exhibition for a 28-day period, and we receive about a quarter of the submissions that we received as part of this process. We've recently started utilising QR codes linking to our pages. And now that that's taken off with check-ins for COVID, people are really welcoming to that new technology. We also found that our take-up rates of our engagement was really well received when we did social media posts, and we could track the usage of our tools, especially the Balancing Act tool, following recent the hours after we put a social media post up. And the other ways we did, I've seen on that slide through e-newsletters and stuff, but it needs to be noted that the Balancing Act was our most successful contribution tool. I might jump over to the tool, if that's possible here, just before I go into the results of it, just to show you how it works. So we were a little bit different in how we utilized the tool. We're at the very beginning of our housing strategy process, and we're not so much providing options to the community to discuss. We're at the point where we're saying, if we're to provide housing, how do you want it to be seen and in what form do you want it? So our housing strategy tool was built around a Balancing Act, a budgetary tool almost in reverse. And if we start here, we started with some general instructions on how the tool works for us. And we tried to get people to enter the mind frame of not being able to just say, don't provide any more housing. We wanted to force them to make a decision, which is what we have to do as a strategic policy maker. So we needed the tool to be really simple, but effective at the same time. And we wanted to inbuilt some education into the tool, not just to get feedback. So the tool looks very similar to how our American Friends tool looks, except ours is used in a little bit different way. Ours is at the point where we've got a need to prepare a housing strategy divvied up into different uses. As Andrew mentioned, we are bordered by waterways and national parks, so new greenfield sites are not an option. So any new housing in the area is infill housing, and that is what we're discovering that the community is having a lot of concerns with, because they're used to living in a low density street surrounded by trees and large backyards. It's very difficult to continually provide that when you don't have the area to provide single dwellings. So inevitably, everything that we're providing has to be an increase on the density that's currently there. So for that reason, single dwellings were limited in the amount of dwellings they could provide to reach a housing target. We use the information icon to provide a bit of an idea of each usage of housing and what that means. With the single dwellings, the limits were mentioned in here at 30 dwellings, so we've got some really large sites that might be subdivided. We also provided some graphics to explain, just so people know exactly what they're on. We linked with the dual occupancies and the other uses. We tried to really simply say that to deliver, if you wanted to select 1,000 dual occupancies as your entire housing strategy, you'd need to expect that 1,000 single dwelling sites would have to be redeveloped. So the change is going to be really widespread. Whereas if they go for a really high density usage, The impact will be isolated to approximately 60 to 120 single dwelling sites, but you will see a big dramatic change in the character. So that's where we show what they can expect at that higher density. And just a really simple graphic to say, yeah, as I said, 1,000 additional dwellings will result in that. So the tool was used in a way that people would simply add to their housing typology to create their mix. While the bar at the top was in the red, they weren't able to submit. So it forced them to get to the point where they had created a mix that they were happy with. And once they tailored the tool in a way that they wanted to see the Sutherland Shire develop, sorry, I'll just wait till I get it in the green. It told them they've met their housing strategy and it allowed them to submit their plan. So in doing that, we just asked for an age group, which suburb they are from, and then an open-ended question on why they picked that housing mix. In going back over the data, these 3 questions at the end were really essential and really helped us get an idea of how people were coming up with the mixes that they had. The open-ended question on this, some people really elaborated and gave us a lot of detail, and they'd obviously put a lot of thought into how their mix came about. And what we found is that the submissions, because we'd required them to put some thought into their mix to start with, we weren't simply getting a negative comment to us. So of the 287 submissions received, 285 of them were positive, saying that if they get their head around it, they have to provide housing. This is how they want to see it, and then they elaborated on why. And often it was that they may have chosen the higher density areas in our centres to preserve the low density areas and the suburban character, or other people had chosen to keep the lower density character through the dual occupancies and townhouse style developments, bearing in mind that it would be a more large scale impact across the suburban areas. So I would recommend just that open-ended question at the end. It was optional, but we found that a majority of nearly every single person provided a summary of why they did that. And it helped us at the back end when we reported on our findings, just to give, I guess, the framework that people and thinking behind the decisions that those people made. So when I'll go back to the PowerPoint, if I share here, this is just a really simple breakup of what we received back from the community. So essentially it was almost 30-30-30 between dual occupancies, villas and townhouses and apartments. And this is the data that we're now using, aligning that with our state targets and saying that if we have, as an example, 1,000 dwellings that we have to achieve in the next 5 years, 35% of them will try and accommodate through dual occupancies, the 20% in apartments below 6 stories. And that is giving us a ground so when we take these options to formal exhibition with the community to say, this is what we heard from you. You've been involved in the journey from the get-go, and we're just doing what you guys are telling us along this, instead of us skipping this step and just going to them with options that they haven't been involved in the past. So it's a really beneficial way that we've been able to gather feedback while also educating the community in simply not being able to say no to more growth, but if we're accepting growth, this is how they want to see the area grow into the future. So that's essentially the breakdown of our simple use of the tool, but it's had some really good feedback, and it will be beneficial for our detailed plan making from here on in.
That was great. And I just, somebody just chatted me, brilliant. I love this approach. And what I love about what you did, Jordan, it's just so simple, but it really is just sort of a fundamental question. And it's a great way to sort of ease the public into thinking about what it actually means to come up with a housing plan that's going to have a steep numerical goal attached to it. So thank you for sharing that as well, Andrew, as well. So I want to invite questions, and maybe we'll start first, just letting, or questions and or comments, letting the 3 of you, talk with each other or ask each other questions. Christopher Jordan was the first penguin off the ice here. to sort of do this, and in some ways it doesn't look as snazzy as Renata's, but it was actually pretty darn functional, and it worked just fine. But I think it would work even better next time, possibly with a map. So anyway, I just let the three of you talk a little bit amongst yourselves about your experiences, or comment on what each other has done.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask Jordan. So we did a scenario like what you did probably about 7-8 years ago, when we were doing our big comprehensive plan updates and trying to get folks around the idea of, okay, are we going to expand the limits of the city and grow out into the hinterland to the south? And so we did something real similar. We did it with cups and poker chips in an in-person setting. We actually had a big revolt in the room where people were saying, I don't accept the premise of your question, because I don't want to be limited to, are these people going in the city and increasing density, or are we growing the city out? I think it should be some other jurisdiction's problem to bring these people in. Did you have any sort of circumstance like that? Were you getting calls from people or emails or whatnot of people saying, no, this needs to be addressed in some different way?
Yeah, so we often get, everyone says that the road capacity and the trains and that can't handle the current density that we've got. How can we be adding more to the area? So they all say we shouldn't have housing until the infrastructure is increased to align with that. And that's an argument that it's solid and it's based, but what we try to tell them is if we get more infrastructure capacity than what we've got now, you've got to expect massive growth in the housing that's going to align with that. You can't get the infrastructure and not the housing attached to it. And the issue we also have is that people in suburbia are happy to have the housing go into the centres and increase that, but with the increased population comes the congestion on the road. So we're in this, it's almost a continual battle with the residents that we've got. And there's arguments that we have in terms of the infrastructure being at capacity, but also the impact of the change. So I tried to explain it to someone once. It's like holding a balloon. And if you hold the balloon up, you've got height, but it's a smaller area. But if you squash it down, that same mass is spread over a larger area. That's essentially what we're doing with housing in our area, is that we have parameters with the rivers and the national park that we can't go any further out. We're forced to infill where we currently are. So as a planner, we're trying to balance everything, as well as the community saying they don't want to see any change to their current suburban settings, which isn't something that we can simply do. So yeah, we do hear a lot, but as I said in the presentation, this tool has been the first time I've ever been involved in discussions with the community where there's been constructive and positive work come out of their feedback, and that's outweighed the negative submissions and just kind of an attack on council. The tool has, I guess, changed people's way of thinking and putting them in our perspective more so than just telling us what they don't want and us having to try and turn that into something. It's bringing them into our position and helping us.
Well, it's nice to hear that Australia isn't too different from the United States in a lot of respects. So thank you for commiserating in the pain.
Yeah. Renata, it looked like you were about to ask a question.
Yeah, I had a question for Christopher. I meant to ask this last time, but I forgot. You mentioned that you all set a threshold of 65% buy-in for a site. How did you determine that as the figure?
So it was really in looking at the data. Once we noticed that by and large, every site, either from an existing site that was being looked at for increasing density or a candidate site that would be moved into a multifamily zoning district, that we were getting over 55% for that. We're like, okay, we can't just say that everything's a go. We needed to set some additional threshold. And knowing that we only had about 90 or so submissions, we felt like, okay, this gives us a cross sample of the community, but it's not like if we had something more statistically valid, we had a couple hundred responses, or we knew that they were controlled for the demographics, then we probably would have just gone with a real simple 50+1. We felt more comfortable with more of that 65% sort of super majority level of there's good there's good interest from those that have come to the table. And we also didn't want to walk in with the council and say, hey, we're going to recommend all of these because then your buffer is as large, they would have felt like we're choosing too many. It would have been a little overload for them. We needed some parameters, and that felt like a safe one to go with.
That's great. So, oh, go ahead, Jordan, please.
Oh, I was just going to ask, did any of you guys embed your tools into social media because we found that was a really good way for us to reach a large amount of people. And the way the tool worked, it was really easy for us to embed it. And we found that it's kind of an engaging tool. It's almost like, it's like a game for someone to play. And I think instead, when we've embedded, I don't know, links to surveys in the past, we'd have minimal take up, but with this tool, the embedding and I guess the kind of visual stimulation that it had, it was something that people could easily do and fill out. And we found it worked really well on smartphones. So that's why I think part of our rate was really high compared to our other engagement tools.
I think also the engagement is much higher on this kind of tool, more so than a survey, because it's the messaging around the outcomes is very different. Like, you know, you submit a survey, it goes into the black hole or the void, and like theoretically, you know, the planners, if they're doing their job, will bring it back and say, we heard this, we did this. But I think it's a lot more meaningful for people to kind of feel like they're participating and shaping their built environment in this way, and kind of envisioning it more than, you know, like a survey saying, yes, I want single family houses, or no, I don't want single family houses. It's kind of, you know, they get to you know, mold the clay a little bit. And so
yeah.
I think, that was like part of the messaging that we used to promote it as the activity as well, is like literally shape your city. Like you get to do that. It's not just us asking you 5 questions and then you like never think about it again. It's like, oh wow, I got to say like I want it all near BART because then people don't need to drive as much, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think we're exactly the same in that an open-ended submission that we get, it's up to our interpretation of what the people writing to us were suggesting. Whereas when we had them and we got raw data to say this is the typology they chose, and then their open-ended question supported that, we could easily report back, I guess, scientifically what they had requested to us. And it wasn't as much of us trying to read between the lines of what they'd written to us. And we were getting kind of live input. I think if it wasn't for COVID, we would have utilized that meeting tool quite readily. I think it was good to see that you've done it on Zoom. I'm not sure what the restrictions will be like here for our next engagement, but I think given that we'll have options and we'll be able to map, much like you guys have done, the meeting tool looks like it'll be a really useful thing for us.
Good.
It just occurred to me that the benefit in how, you know, housing is such a complicated topic, and one of the benefits that I've seen in using this tool is that it quantifies the qualitative. Like
exactly.
It kind of, yeah, like it gives us that data to kind of look, because you were talking about reading between the lines. It's like, okay, we create the lines and people select or don't select it, and kind of give us that information to work with.
That's a really nice way of putting that, Renata. And the way that we talk about it, that, you know, one of the differences between a survey and a simulation and the interaction and the data you get is that a simulation puts a lot of things into play and requires people to both understand a little bit about what they're interacting with, but then to make a judgment about a trade-off. So it really calls forth their values. And I think that's where it becomes very useful. We also talk about, it's a tool for empathy. It puts people in the shoes of those of you who are actually making the decisions. It requires them to meet the goal. But Renata, just poetically, you said it gives them a chance to mold the clay a bit. I just love that. That was great. So thank you.
We also took ours to primary schools and high schools and sent the links out to the youth, because essentially we're doing a plan for the future, and we also gave it to our age community. So we saw the full spread of the community being involved in this. And I think that helps us when reporting it back and saying, this is what we heard from you guys, and this is what you want to see. Everyone at different stages of their life are after a different housing typology, and the tool covered everyone's needs. And given that it was so user-friendly, we did get feedback from everyone in the community. So when we worked with the aged community, we took an iPad and had it logged in and had them fill in the survey on our and submit. And when we did it with the schools, we simply contacted the school and sent them the link to it and gave them some frequently asked questions and a background piece. And we found that we're getting submissions from kids as young as 14 and 13, and we got all the way up to someone in their 90s, I think, was the oldest we heard. And we typically don't hear from that part of the community, especially with online engagement. So yeah, we found that given the simplicity of the tool and the fact that it could be done not having to sit at a computer, it did work really well.
That's great. So one of the things that we're proud of, occasionally we can see where people are coming from, where they're being referred from by looking at our analytics. And this is mostly the case, it's actually exclusively at this point, when it has to do with the budget simulations. And we have one that we do for the US government and for the state of Colorado, so large ones. And one of the times we're most proud is when we see something like, the referral being like from Mrs. Smith's, honors civics class, and then there's like 32 entries, and it's just great. But I hadn't even thought about promoting the housing simulation to people within schools, and I think that's a brilliant idea as well.
Yeah. The council,
please.
I think there was a question there, did the parents get involved? So the council, our council runs leisure centres. So we did provide links to the posters and links to our engagement page at the childcare centres, with the intention being that the parents fill in the surveys. And given that one of our major issues in the Sutherland Shire is housing our future families, affordability is an issue, and just the ability of these families to get into houses with backyards and things. Hearing from the parents of young families was really pivotal and will help us in decision making moving forward. So yeah, a lot of the surveys were actually aimed at parents of the really young kids, but as we got through to, I think it's your middle school, which is our high school, we wanted to hear from the students themselves, because in the next 10 or so years, they'll be looking for housing themselves and trying to get into the community.
That's brilliant. And Andrew, I'm wondering if I sort of made this comment, with a little bit of a basis for comparison, and I won't necessarily expect you to have a basis for comparison, but I've always been impressed with the culture of engagement. I mean, for a couple of decades now in Australia, it just seems like it's just ingrained in the sense of good governance to consult and to engage the community. And one of the reasons I bet that you all had such good take up was that you've invested in developing the capacity to engage your public, and you've got, I think, an online destination that people know where to go to. And I'm just wondering if you can sort of comment on that, on just having, sort of building that sort of muscle memory to have, to communicate with your residents, how that is helpful and how you're using that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, there's probably a little bit of self-preservation wound up in our motivation to consult and consult widely as well. Our community, I'm sure, like many communities in California and across the states, have got a lot to say on planning issues. And Jordan touched on the fact that growth, in housing, for our community, probably the most common thing that comes up is growth in traffic. Will they be able to get a car park at the beach and at the other destinations they like to go to? And having that conversation early in our planning process is just so important. We're at the front end of a long process. I guess I'd compare it to we're working through the comprehensive planning process that you would do in the United States. That will lead to zoning changes, which are legislated changes, which give rise to changes in property value and things like that. If we haven't done a rigorous effort in our early consultation, we will certainly fail at that last hurdle. So it is very important. I'm sure that you can all relate to this, but the more effort you put in up front early on in the engagement, the better prospects you have at the back end when it comes to making those critical decisions and bedding down our housing strategy into zoning rules and laws for our community. And, you know, our community have a lot to say on most issues, but housing and growth is probably their favourite subject.
Well, I think you'll find some shared concerns, especially in California and especially around the Bay Area, I think. So, well, anything else that you all, any comments or questions you have for each other from the attendees, the participants? All right. Well,
I just want to
Renata,
give
please.
a thanks actually first to those who came before me. Really appreciate the groundwork you guys laid out.
Yeah. Wow. And everybody who comes after you, Renata, can give thanks to you for working on the interactive map, because that's a pretty cool thing too. So, all right. Well, thank you all. And Andrew, thank you as well for joining us and giving us your perspective. And it's really been terrific to, sorry. Okay. I thought we had another question, but it was just a thank you coming in. But thank you all for participating, and we look forward to being in touch and continuing to learn from each other. So take care and thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.